So, first of all, we want to give you a brief introduction on an initiative of the Presbyterian Hunger Program that's housed within our International Hunger Concerns Office, which is called Joining Hands. Oh, if I can get my... So, Joining Hands as an initiative of PHP is a proven way to mobilize people in focused campaigns to tackle systemic causes of hunger, both in the United States and abroad. Joining Hands is a committed global network standing in solidarity to work for justice and the restoration of the earth and the rights of people to claim the life abundant promised by God. So Joining Hands has three campaign areas, one of which is focused around food and land. So supporting efforts that promote the right of people to produce the food they need for survival in accordance with their cultural traditions and through ecologically sustainable methods, as well as the right of people to access land to produce food and provide housing, particularly with indigenous communities whose traditional rights are threatened. Another campaign area is the extractive industries and water. So in this campaign area, we work to uphold transparency and oppose corruption in countries where mineral and resource extraction create wealth for a few and rampant poverty for the vulnerable majority, a consequence of the resource curse. This campaign area, we deal with the impact of the extractive industries on communities of people and the environment, advancing the right of people to access clean water protected from pollution. In our third area, we work on trade reform. So we're working for fairness in the global economy so that trade agreements protect the rights of workers, consumers, the environment, and public health, as well as human rights. We work in partnership with networks in 9 countries. They're Bolivia, Cameroon, DRC, Egypt, El Salvador, Haiti, India, Sri Lanka, and Peru. And so ways that you can get involved in doing this work with us, you can travel to places where Joining Hands is active to experience the reality of organizing for systemic change. You can join if you're an individual passionate about fighting systemic causes of poverty. There's a place for you around the table, and you can contact our associate for International Hunger Concerns who coordinates the Joining Hands initiative, Valerie Nodum. For more information on joining one of our campaign tables, we have one for each of the campaign areas that I just described. And ACT can respond to requests for action from our global partners through letter writing, engaging members of Congress, conscious consumerism, study groups, vigils, and prayer, as well as other options. You can visit our website for more information. And the reason why we are bringing people together to talk about the extractive industries and the intersection between the extractive industries and poverty is because a lot of our partners across the world have been identifying the extractive industries as one of the areas that is leading to systemic causes of hunger and poverty in many of these countries in which we are partnered with networks. So when we're working, the reason why we're interested in this is because we're interested in supporting communities impacted by water pollution from mining, by campaigning for the protection of the environment and health, holding extractive corporations accountable to their financial, social, and environmental obligations, and advocating for transparency in payments made by extractive industry corporations to governments. So we want more people to join and work alongside and to learn about these issues. And these issues are prevalent not only overseas, but they're also happening in the United States as well. So often we think that things are, things are happening outside of ourselves in the US, but there's also a lot of these same issues are very prevalent in the US as well. So our first, as for our speakers, let me just introduce all three of them quickly to you before we go on to our first speaker. Our first speaker will be Reverend Jed Coble. He's a PCUSA mission coworker who serves as the Presbyterian Hunger Program's facilitator for Joining Hands in Peru. And he facilitates international partnerships and global advocacy campaigns there. He's a former pastor from New York, he's a former pastor in New York, development worker in Nicaragua, and justice intern in the Philippines. Jed brings together his many passions in helping the church address root causes of poverty from a Peruvian context. He and his wife, Jenny, the young adult volunteer coordinator in Peru, live in Lima. And then we have Robin Blakeman. She's an ordained PCUSA teaching elder, a mother, and an 8th generation West Virginia resident. She is currently employed by the Ohio Valley Environmental Coalition, and she does volunteer work with the West Virginia Presbytery. Then we have Carlos Lozana Acosta. He is a Colombian lawyer and advisor to the Freshwater Preservation Program of his organization, IDA. He works from Bogota, Colombia. He has his LLM, which is a legal degree, I believe, in environmental and natural resources law from the University of Oregon, which he attended as a Fulbright scholar. And he has worked as a researcher and consultant for Colombian and international NGOs, as well as cooperation agencies on issues of water, mining, and human rights. So now we'll start with our first presenter, Reverend Jed Coble, and I hope you all really enjoy this.
Good afternoon. My name is Jed Coble. Thank you very much, Eileen, and thank you, Robin and Carlos, who will be presenting after me. Today is Independence Day here in Peru. Happy July 28th to everyone. And later this afternoon, the president of Peru, Ollanta Humala, will make his annual State of the Union address. In all likelihood, he will speak to the mining industry here in Peru. He will speak to how Peru continues to be a leading country in mining, comments he's made earlier this year and throughout the course of his administration. And indeed, Peru ranks in the world, 6th in production of gold, 2nd in silver and copper and zinc, as well as other minerals. And mining industry continues to be a growing aspect of the economy here. 61% of exports in 2013 were from mining. Almost 3/4 of Peruvian exports are related to the extractive industry. And you can see where the dollar amount, how mining exports continues to grow in Peru. And so he'll likely speak to the growth of the economy based on mining, perhaps echoing the words of Barack Obama, who in February of this year said that Peru has become the world's envy due to its outstanding economic growth in the last decade. And indeed, you can see that even during the financial crisis that began in 2008 and into 2009 on a global scale, Peru's economy continued to grow. And since the turn of the century, the poverty rate has fallen from around 60% down to currently about 23 or 24%. And so there's continued growth here in Peru, and it is riding on the back of the mining industry. And you see that here in the city of Lima with continued construction, skyscrapers going up every day, new shopping centers. The wealth is building here in the city of Lima, but at what cost? And that's what we want to address today, is what's happening outside of the urban sector, particularly here in Lima, and what's happening in the rural, in the countryside. To begin with, in the Peruvian context, it's important to understand a little bit of the natural regions of Peru. On the Pacific coast, it's a desert coast where Lima is located and the vast majority of the population lives. And quickly to the east, you go up 20,000 feet or higher into the Andes Mountains, and on the backside is the Amazon jungle. It's one of the most ecologically diverse countries in the world. And from a bird's eye view, we can see a map of Peru, and running right down through the middle of it is like a spine are the Andes Mountains, which are where the headwaters are. More than 12,000 mountaintop lagoons and water retention zones are in this area, occupying about 34% of the territory of Peru. This is where water begins, up here in the mountains. But it's also where the gold and the silver and the zinc and the copper and many other metals are located. And so that's where concessions are happening, mining concessions. This map is about 5 years old, in which about 16, almost 17% of the national territory had been conceded to the mining industry. Today, 2015, more than 20% of the national territory has been conceded to the mining industry, and this doesn't include concessions to oil and natural gas industries in the Amazon area. And so there are mining projects, major mining projects, many of them open pit, running right through the Andes Mountains, and many of them are foreign companies, including from the U.S., such as Newmont Mining, among others. And the mining sector accounts for over 13% of foreign direct investment in Peru, more than $10 billion in worth. And so where there are mining projects, there is mining contamination. And here we see a map of major environmental contamination from the mining industry. It's estimated that mining releases over 13 billion cubic meters of effluents into Peru's watercourse every year. And you can see some samples of what that may look like. But an interesting map that coincides with the watershed as well as the mining activity is a map of poverty levels in Peru. Here these points note areas of poverty above 50%. Today, poverty has reduced down to, on the national level, to about 23% of the total population. That's living on less than $100 per person per month within a family. But at levels of extreme poverty, those living on less than $2 per day, the vast majority of those folks live in this region, exactly where the mining is happening. And so economic activity in those areas is either mining or it's agriculture, and that's where a lot of the conflict is centered on. And here we have a map of social conflicts in Peru. As of last month, there were 210 social conflicts registered in the country, of which 93 are related specifically to mining. And so these red areas are where there's the most intense conflict in the country, followed by the yellow areas, and green is where there is less conflict. And so the intense conflict in the country is primarily through the Andes Mountains. So you put those maps together, and here you have the headwaters, the mining concessions, the mining activity, the mining contamination, and how that parallels with the poverty levels and the social conflicts. And so the causes of these conflicts, certainly they're related to environmental contamination and the impact on ecosystems. Much of it then has to do with the conflict between the economic activity, which is primarily agriculture in these regions, and the lifestyle and the way of living that stretches back hundreds of years to this mining activity, which is not integrated into this way of life in the mountains and is impacting lifestyles. And what has been the role of the government in all of this? Well, again, President Humala will likely make comments today, as he's made in recent weeks and months, about wanting to be more receptive to foreign investment and how that is a backbone of growth, particularly foreign investment in the mining industry. And so over the last couple of years, what that has looked like in his administration has been a limited prior consultation with communities where mining activity is being planned, a lack of a transparent concession process for mining concessions. There's a lack of zoning laws for mining with regard to respect for headwaters, weakened environmental standards, environmental impact studies that are not under the auspice of the Ministry of the Environment, kind of the equivalent of the EPA in the U.S. Rather, they're under the auspice of the Ministry of Energy and Mines, seeming to be a conflict of interest. There's also criminalization of protesters, those who are speaking out against mining activity. And where there are conflicts, they're being managed by the federal government, the very ones who are providing the concessions to mining companies. And then there's also this subscription to an investor state dispute settlement mechanism found in trade agreements, and I'm going to speak to this a little bit later, but effectively it's a mechanism that allows foreign investors such as mining companies to circumvent environmental regulations in the countries where they're operating. And so all of these positions taken by the government, Peru has allowed outside evaluators such as Standard & Poor's to say that Peru exhibits a high grade of investment. So we want to look at what this looks like at the local level, and through the emblematic case of La Arroya, where our Joining Hands partners in Peru have been active for over a decade now, how we are addressing a particular issue at the local level, the national level, and international level, and then give you some concrete actions that you could take in this calendar year. So the case of La Arroya, it's located in the central Andes at about 13,000 feet above sea level, and it's often considered to be one of the 10 most contaminated cities in the world, where 98% of children ages 6 to 12 have been found to have lead poisoning. That number is a little bit lower today because the activity in the town has been paralyzed for a couple of years, but it's still the majority of children have lead poisoning. The source of contamination here is actually a metallurgical smelter. So mining activity around the country is directed towards this smelter so that the products can be shipped around the world. And the smelter is run by a company called Joe Run Peru, which is purchased by the Renco Group. This is a holding company privately owned and located in New York City. At the height of its production, it was emitting 2 million pounds of lead, arsenic, cadmium, and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere every single day. And when the Renco Group bought this in 1997, it was given 10 years to install new technologies to lower the emissions in La Arroya. When it did not fulfill that obligation within 10 years, the state gave it multiple extensions to install this technology. Nonetheless, at the end of 2008, when the global financial crisis began and metals prices temporarily fell, it declared bankruptcy. But it blamed the state for its bankruptcy, claiming that it was excessive environmental regulations that were causing its financial problems, in particular having to install these new technologies. And so at about that same time, there was a trade agreement between the United States and Peru that was implemented, and the Renco Group took advantage of that. In particular, took advantage of a clause within that trade agreement, and that clause provides a mechanism called the Investor State Dispute Settlement Mechanism, which allows for foreign investors, in this case Renco Group, to sue a country, in this case the state of Peru, if it believes that that country's implementation of certain or enforcement of certain regulations affects its profits. So in 2011, the Renco Group filed a lawsuit in a foreign tribunal circumventing domestic courts in Peru for $800 million, claiming that it had gone bankrupt because of these excessive environmental regulations. That lawsuit is ongoing, and it will last for another 4 to 5 years before any settlement happens, but it is already impacting what's happening in La Arroya. Because of the bankruptcy, the creditors, which are other mining companies and banks, and including the state, want to sell this smelter, and in so doing, they've set new standards in La Arroya. In fact, they have weakened the environmental emission standards in La Arroya in order to make it more sellable to another foreign investor. Another potential foreign investor could, in fact, be the very same Renko group who is suing the government right now. So what are our partners doing locally? The focus of our campaign for over a decade now has been the health of the children in La Arroya. And so a couple of years ago, because of the efforts of our partners, they were able to get a regional ordinance implemented that requires specialized human, public, and environmental health care program that tends to populations affected by heavy metals contaminations. There's no such program like this in the country of Peru, despite all the environmental contamination from the mining industry. So we got this ordinance implemented, we got it passed, but it has not yet been implemented. And the great challenge to that is financing. It's going to be costly. Now, one might look at this campaign and say we're addressing the symptoms of the problem, and to a certain extent we are, but it's important to note that the health of the population and the environment in which they live has always been the focus of our efforts and the motivator for all of our work. But also it's something of a backdoor strategy because the financing of this program would be much cheaper if they just control the emission standards in the first place. And that is an effort that we're working on at the national level with other organizations recognizing the mining industry throughout the entire country. And so together we're working at implementing or getting a set of laws passed at the national level that would provide greater consultation for communities where mining projects are proposed, more transparency in the concession process, zoning to protect headwaters, environmental impact studies enforced by the Ministry of the Environment, stricter environmental standards such as stricter emissions standards in La Arroya, increased sharing of the mining benefits to fund healthcare programs like we have in La Arroya, and decentralizing the conflict management so that the federal government isn't the one overseeing these conflicts. The challenge to this is a very hostile environmental attitude in Peru, in which protesters are being criminalized, and organizations, NGOs that are promoting a new mining industry in Peru are being attacked by the government. And at the international level, we are promoting the elimination of this investor-state dispute mechanism from trade agreements. This is the mechanism that gives foreign investors the right to sue a country if it enforces environmental regulations or other public policies that could cost them money. And strategically, the place to begin with this is by addressing this mechanism in new trade agreements that are being negotiated. And the major one that's being negotiated right now is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, often referred to as the TPP, and that includes the United States and Peru. So we are promoting the elimination of this mechanism from that trade negotiation. And so some actions you can take in this calendar year. In August and September, we'll be promoting a collection of signatures for a letter that we are sending to the government here in Peru about these weakened emission standards in La Arroya, suggesting that these weakened emission standards will affect its ability to implement a healthcare program for the people of La Arroya. So we'll be looking for signatures internationally as well as across Peru. And that'll be happening in August and September. And also we're asking for folks in the U.S. to advocate with their representatives in Congress to not accept the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement with this investor-state dispute settlement mechanism within it. So to learn more about that, you can go to the Joining Hands website. You can also write to me directly, and here's my email address. So that is what's happening with mining in Peru and how we're addressing it with our partners, and a couple concrete ways in which you can join with us. So thank you very, very much.
Thanks, Jed. And now we will go on to our panelist, Robin Blakeman.
Hi, I want to thank you for the opportunity to share both the natural beauty and current challenges of the place I and my ancestors for 8 generations have called home. West Virginia's mixed mesophytic forests are one of the world's most biologically diverse forests. Its freshwater communities are the richest temperate freshwater ecosystems in the world. Our lush eastern deciduous forests are considered resilient and highly connected. They drive the hydrologic cycles and supply water for much of the eastern United States public drinking water. As our world faces the unprecedented threat of global warming, the destruction of these forests represents the loss of important natural carbon sinks. This is one of our beautiful natural streams in our mountains. And this is what is happening to those streams and the ecosystems. In West Virginia, the organization that I work with, the Ohio Valley Environmental Coalition, is a leader in grassroots organizing to end mountaintop removal and related mining abuses. And we've been working on this since 1997. Every 11 days, the explosives that blow apart our mountains equal the power of one Hiroshima bomb. West Virginia is also one of the only states to have both extensive gas fracking and mountaintop removal in our state. Our beautiful rural areas are quickly becoming industrialized zones. Water systems that many lower income people depend upon are being poisoned and depleted. This is the Hobet 21 mine on the border of Logan and Lincoln counties in West Virginia. It now spans more than 20 square miles in size. Throughout central Appalachia, an area the size of Delaware, more than 1 million acres, has already been decimated. After coal is extracted, the leftover mountain is pushed into valleys, converting crucial headwater streams to coal waste dumps. So far, more than 2,000 miles of streams have been annihilated or polluted. This is a valley fill in progress. Coal companies call this controlled gravity placement. And this is what happens sometimes below those valley fills. Mountaintop removal is annihilating communities and polluting streams and drinking water supplies in West Virginia and throughout central Appalachia. Flooding is a huge issue. Often mud trails can be seen from aerial views leading from mountaintop removal sites to flooded valleys below. Coal slurry impoundments, we have hundreds of them in our hills, do fail. In 1972, an impoundment at Buffalo Creek failed, killing 125 people in West Virginia. Here, a man watches as Massey Energy tries to clean up the largest coal slurry impoundments failure in Inez, Kentucky, in 2000, where 307 million gallons of toxic coal sludge polluted more than 75 miles of streams in Kentucky and West Virginia, killing everything in the streams. The U.S. EPA said it was the worst environmental disaster in the Southeast. The Exxon Valdez disaster was an 11 million gallon spill by comparison. It's my contention that people of faith should be concerned about these issues. I was very glad to read these words from our wise stated clerk a couple of years ago. Mountaintop removal by damaging God's creation and the well-being of our brothers and sisters runs contrary to our Christian obligation to each other and to our environment. Mountaintop removal coal mining is an unacceptable desecration of God's good creation. Grady Parsons is from Tennessee. one of our 4 states where Appalachian mountaintop removal coal mining happens. The other 3 are Kentucky, Virginia, and West Virginia. In making these statements, Reverend Parsons was speaking with the authority of past PCUSA General Assembly decisions, including a 2006 Commissioner's Resolution on the problems of mountaintop removal. I'm going to narrow our focus for a minute to some of those communities most affected by mountaintop removal. Dr. Michael Hendricks, currently with the University of Indiana, formerly a West Virginia University professor, has joined with colleagues to publish some very important health studies in peer-reviewed journals. Here is a brief synopsis of 2 of those studies, one related to birth defects and the other to cancer rates. You can find more at the link I have posted on this slide. In my humble opinion, these studies make opposition to mountaintop removal a pro-life stance, with the latest numbers indicating a 42% higher rate of birth defects in mountaintop removal areas. I should note that the cancer rates overall in West Virginia are above the national average. Controls were placed on these studies for risk factors, other risk factors like smoking. Also, there are alarming cancer clusters in some communities. These include rare brain and stomach cancers. On the regional level, you can see an outline of counties in central Appalachia in this slide, with poverty rates indicated by various shades of blue or white. The darkest blue are the highest poverty rates. The red rash of dots overlaid on this map indicate large-scale surface mine or mountaintop removal sites. This map was done in 2000 and is in the process of being updated. We are very sure there will be more of the red rash and also more dark blue counties within the same area. Here are some expert reports of current West Virginia poverty statistics. Margie Hale, the executive director of Kids Count, said that the poverty statistics among children are alarming. We learned from the 2015 data book that 100,000 children are living in poverty in West Virginia, she said. That's more than 1 in 4 kids. The book also ranked West Virginia 43rd worst in the country for child well-being, which was down from last year's ranking of 37th. The number of children living in poverty had risen almost 15% from 2008. And from our West Virginia Council of Churches Director, Reverend Jeff Allen, who is writing to invite Pope Francis to visit West Virginia. West Virginia had the highest rate of unemployment in the U.S. in June 2015. 18% of West Virginians live in poverty. West Virginia has the highest rate of drug overdose deaths, double the national average, and the second highest heroin deaths in the United States. If the extractive industries are trying to make us rich, I wish they'd stop. Now, on the broader focus, national problems from the coal industry's equally poisonous rhetoric happen often. Here are some quotes from Peabody Energy's recently submitted 71 pages of comments to the White House Council on Environmental Quality, arguing against considering greenhouse gas emissions as part of analysis conducted under the National Environmental Policy Act. As I said, there's 3 of the more outrageous quotes. My favorite one, and the most outrageous to me, is number 3. U.S. coal has a strong relationship with increased life expectancy. Clearly, coal industry executives and their writers are living in another metaphorical universe from the rest of us. Unfortunately, statements like these are still parroted by politicians who are beholden to the fossil fuel industry executive campaign contributions when it comes to legislative debates and actions. Here's a case in point. Our State Department of Environmental Protection's top administrator, the Secretary, is appointed by our governor. Following a gas fracking tour with residents of Doddridge County, West Virginia, the DP Secretary, Randy Huffman, whose picture is here, was asked this question: Are you willing to recommend to the governor and legislature that state employ the precautionary principle and place a moratorium on fracking and related activities? This is a well site that Randy may have visited. And some background on the precautionary principle. It's a philosophy embraced by public health and environmental advocates across West Virginia, as well as by the 2014 General Assembly. In March, organizers of an event in Charleston which pointed out public health risks of mountaintop removal attempted unsuccessfully to meet with Huffman, then to ask him to employ the precautionary principle and quit issuing permits for mountaintop removal. The precautionary principle states, in summary, when an activity raises threats of harm to human health or the environment, precautionary measures should be taken, even if some of the cause and effect relationships are not fully established scientifically. These are the people who mobilized at the Department of Environmental Protection to try to place a moratorium on mountaintop removal. Now back to Randy's comments in Doddridge County. His not so surprising response to the residents of Doddridge was, if I start pounding my fist at the West Virginia Capitol, it is going to be a fruitless effort. I would become ineffective. There are too many entities at play in Charleston. They'd laugh me out of the Capitol building. It would limit my effectiveness. Well, his effectiveness is already a big question mark. You may recall the MCHM spill, where a coal washing chemical poisoned the water for 300,000 West Virginia citizens. What we now know about those tanks is that they were not inspected in a long, long time by the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection. And you can see here that the gas industry favors many of the rulings that the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection has endorsed since then. Here are some actions people can take to make a big difference. Number one, stop funding mountaintop removal. Some of the big banks have. And you can tell from these slides and links that Rainforest Action Network is one of our big green allies in this. We've also had many faith-based allies, including the Earthquakers, whom were instrumental in PNC Bank agreeing to stop funding mountaintop removal. Also, we have a homegrown fossil fuel divestment movement within PCUSA. An overture fostered by this group and endorsed by many different presbyteries was considered by the 2014 General Assembly. After serious debate in committee and on the floor of General Assembly, it was referred to MRTI for their consideration and recommendations. The Fossil-Free PCUSA group continues intense advocacy efforts to gain passage of this or a similar overture in 2016. You can check out their website for more information. Also, you can engage in local actions to stop utilizing mountaintop removal mined coal. Fight coal exports wherever possible. A large percentage of mountaintop removal mined coal is shipped out of the country. And you can follow the example of Gainesville, Florida, who voted, the city commission there voted by a 5-2 majority to stop purchasing mountaintop removal mined coal for their public electricity utility. This was the result of a long organizing campaign which involved Gainesville residents working alongside Central Appalachian spokespersons to raise awareness in their communities about the problems associated with mountaintop removal. You can also support policy change, especially the EPA's Clean Power Plan. We'd like for you to support, and we want to work to strengthen the Obama administration's newly released Clean Water Rule. And lastly, on a very personal and local level, for West Virginia's sake, I would request that you sign the petition to invite the Pope to West Virginia's coal fields. We're very serious about this effort and would really love to see him come to one of the poorest places in West Virginia. Thanks for listening. Ultimately, the inconvenient truth of our times is that the remaining fossil fuels, especially coal, must remain in the ground to ensure any kind of healthy future for our communities and ecosystems. This is my perspective from West Virginia. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Robin. And now we'll hear from Carlos Lozana Acosta.
Hi, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you, Carlos.
Okay. Um, Thank you so much for the invitation. I would like to thank you in behalf of the Inter-American Association for Environmental Defense. I'm going to speak about some lessons and facts we have learned from mining activity and its impacts in Latin America. So AIDA is an international organization that works for protecting ecosystems and the communities that depend on them. It's an international nonprofit organization and we use primarily international law to protect the environment. Our objective is to strengthen the people's ability to guarantee their individual and collective right to a healthy environment using the power of national and international environmental law and human rights law. We have a very diverse staff from several countries in the region, as you can see, and we are involved in working with mining cases in several places in Latin America. We work with participating organizations, which are basically local organizations who works from the national perspective to protect ecosystems and communities in the hemisphere. So I would like to start by reflecting about the questions that this webinar focused on. The first of that one is, what is driving the demand for minerals and what is the dynamic of that in Latin America? I am not going to go in deep on this, basically because the presentation that Jet made is so similar to the situation in Colombia, and I think it allows to explain what is going on in the region. But in general, you can say that there is an increase of demand for this kind of resources for several reasons. Emerging countries are demanding more and more resources for their economies, but at the same time, some countries in the global south are offering more and more commodities for the market, and it's becoming more and more important. At the same time, companies are getting bigger and are diversifying themselves, and consequently they are investing in the mining sector, because virtually each sector of the economy, at least the industry, can require minerals, and that's a fact that we cannot ignore. So we are experiencing foreign investment increasing in extractive industries. As far as we know, in the region, the United States, Canada, Australia, and Switzerland, China is always investing a lot in minerals exploration and exploitation in the region, and at the same time, our countries are making an effort to promote this is convenient for the economy. So that is the situation. It is also this includes as well an explosion of infrastructure investments in the region. in several countries, particularly I would say Colombia, Brazil, and Mexico, and this is having an impact on the mining market. So we, for that reason, are experiencing a more important effect of environmental and social impacts in the region. I would say that the presentation that Jed made is the same kind, presents the same kind of impacts we are experiencing in other countries, including Colombia. In general, it is an excellent description about what is going on this topic in the Andean region. I just would add that we can classify the effects, the environmental impacts on these 4 topics: water, air, biodiversity, and soil. Of course, these impacts are cumulative. I mean, some impacts that affect water can affect biodiversity as well, because biodiversity needs water. And the same with oil. Biodiversity is an important component of soils. But in general, you can say that this is the main elements that can be affected by environmental impacts by mining. Just add that, of course, the more important focus and the concern is focus on water pollution from mining activities, because it's the water that communities use for their consumption and economic and cultural activities. Just to say that these effects are connected all the time and can be cumulative, and that is an important approach to the effects. And the social impacts, I would like to classify them using the kind of rights that are usually affected by this. Of course, indigenous rights are affected by this kind of impacts. Water, the human right to water, which is protected in several domestic legislation, is affected as well, and is usually part of the legal strategies to protect it. The right to health, which is very important in Latin American constitutionalism, especially in Colombia, Ecuador, Bolivia, which is protected at the constitutional level and can be used for addressing the social impacts and the environmental impacts that mining activities can have on people. The right to life is usually used también. Healthy environment, participation and property, and even privacy can be affected by the social impacts of these. Of course, as is obvious, environmental and social impacts are connected, and some environmental impacts can imply, of course, social impacts as well. And this is like a general classification of the impacts we might have. And I would like to explain 2 cases that I think are important to understand the gold mining impacts in Colombia. The first one is the Santurban Páramo, which is basically a high altitude wetland which works like a water factory. It provides the resource for more than 1.5 million people in the north of the country. So basically that is the main ecosystemic service that ecosystem provides. But at the same time, there is a gold mining activity very intense from several years ago in the zone, and there is a tension between those activities and the necessity of protecting the páramo. There was also a demarcation process, which was basically a public policy effort in order to determine the boundaries of the ecosystem, like a baseline to protect the system. And there are also efforts to declare protected areas, regional parks, and national parks in the zone. And we have learned a lot from this case, because it's a typical environmental and social conflict that should be addressed from the human rights and environmental law perspective. What we achieved here with the support of the community is the demarcation of part of the system, which is going to be important for the protection, and also we bring to the attention of the government more than 20,000 signatures from the community and people in Colombia and the region to protect the site. And there is another case which is called the La Colosa mine, which is a gold mining project. It's the biggest potential project in Colombia. It will have more than 24 million ounces of gold, which makes this also one of the more important mining projects in the region in Latin America. And it's also affected by the armed conflict and human rights violations. And I'm going to explain what we have learned of that later. This is just to say that this case was relevant for us because it can affect the water provision for almost 1 million people in the Tolima department, in the center of the country. And it's also strategic because it involves national parks and also Ramsar sites. A Ramsar site, it's a place protected, a wetland protected by the International Convention of Wetlands Protections, known as well as the Ramsar Convention. And this is about legal mining in the country, but we also have illegal mining, which has different impacts and requires different approaches as well, not only because the implications for regulatory agencies and even for the criminal policy in the country, but also because the dynamic can be different and even the elements they use can be different as well. They use, for example, mercury, not cyanide, like the legal industry, and for that reason the approach will be a little bit different. It's important to say that this is being a big issue of public order in Colombia. Armed groups are taking participation in this market and it's becoming more and more important for their financial portfolios. And there is a lack of governmental presence and a lack as well of a coherent criminal policy that makes it extremely difficult to deal with this problem in the country. So I think one of the most important challenges that Colombia has and the region, the Andean region, I'm sure as well, in terms of environmental issues currently. We also experience a weak regulation, particularly in zones with the presence of the government not particularly strong, and jurisdiction challenges as well, because these activities do not respect boundaries in our countries. So it can be extremely difficult in some cases to prosecute them, and you need definitely cooperation between countries. There is also a concern about this activity being developed in border zones, which all that means for the efforts to deal with this. And there is also a suggested relation between infrastructure and mining. I mean, the point is that it seems like the far infrastructure goes into the jungles and the ecosystems, the easier is for illegal mining to access to the ecosystems and develop their activities. It's obvious that some of these groups are using infrastructure as a platform to develop their activities. And there is also a concern about the alternatives contributing and participating in illegal mining in some zones. Because not all the persons, of course, involved in this are part of armed groups. Even though armed groups are having an important participation, there are also poor communities that basically have no choice on this, and they have to focus on this economical activity. So we have learned some lessons from our work here that I would like to share with you guys. And the first thing that we have learned is that it's necessary to combine legal strategies, advocacy, and communications. Because sometimes, or at least it happens with some attorneys, they don't realize how important communication is. So for us, in these cases, communications are part of the legal strategy since the beginning of the litigation or the strategy we are going to develop. And the emphasis that you need to put depends on the case and on the context. But it's definitely important to keep in mind that all these strategies are relevant for our cases. It's important to use them also human rights tools. These tools are relevant basically because in our legal systems, at least in Latin America, their status in the domestic legal system is higher than other judicial or administrative remedies. So when you are using human rights, it's not only a language, it's also a legal technique that can be much more effective than using statutory or regulatory tools. It's extremely important. And also, it's important to have in mind that we need to use different branches of law, not only environmental law. In some cases, for example, it's important to have a criminal law approach. In other cases, it's essential to have a human rights approach from the perspective or of civil and political rights, because you need to protect the advocates that are promoting the protection of the environment. So it's usual for us, for example, to have human rights and civil rights attorneys in our environmental coalitions for that purpose. And we need to use sciences, and we need to focus on cumulative impacts. Science, because of course, as is obvious, is important for environmental litigation, because it provides the evidence we need to prove causation, for example, or the damage we are trying to deal with. And cumulative impacts are important because in some cases the boundaries of law allow certain level of pollution or permissible activities that otherwise should be prohibited, in case you are focusing on this having a cumulative impact approach. So for example, some mining projects can be legal under certain standards, but if you have a cumulative approach, the legal consequence can be different, because you are looking at the wood and not only the tree. So other lessons we have learned here from our work with communities is that it's important to promote dialogue, not only within the organizations, but also with, in some cases, with the government, or even with the companies in cases where the communities agrees with this. And this is important to say because the community approach to dialogue is essential for the definition of the strategy. We think that we need to promote organization as well, because it increases the impact of your intervention, definitely. And so this is obvious, but I think it's important to say we need to organize with the communities and with the leaders that are promoting the protection of the environment, because isolation in working can be highly inconvenient. I think that we need to take care of our people and of ourselves in terms of the risks you need to deal with. This is relevant. We have had cases where our interventions, for example, can be risky, and you have to keep in mind that. It's not the same when you try to sue a company or a government from Bogota. And if you are in Bogota, probably, or a capital is okay, but what happens with the people who are in the territories and close to the projects, with the presence of the state is weak and with the effects that can be dangerous for them. So having an approach to protection and human rights protection for them is essential for these strategies. And you need to keep in mind that the situation is not the same depending on the place you are. And it's also essential to identify opportunities for change. Sometimes, I would say, social movements can have challenges identifying opportunities. So it's important to have a very detailed analysis of what is going on and what the opportunities can be. Also, working with partners is essential, and with networks. But keeping in mind that you need to have a role in that. And it's important, especially when you are, for example, in international organizations, to have a clear vision about your role and your added value to the strategy, in order to avoid to replicate efforts that other actors can be doing. And for that purposes, I recommend to have maps of the relevant actors that have to be involved in a strategy when you are thinking to work on a case. It's important as well to identify a message. For example, in some of the cases we're working on, there is biodiversity, there is an approach to climate change, but we find out that the important thing for people in terms of messages is the water. I mean, protecting this ecosystem is important because it's from your water, is where your water comes from. And if you don't protect that ecosystem and advocate for them, you are not going to have water in the big cities in Colombia. That was a very powerful message that was part of our strategy, and it works very well. So you need to identify that according to the rights involved, the political context, the media strategy, and the things you think can touch the people feelings and interests. And our rule that is important for our strategies here is following the money. This is extremely relevant for cases, especially for cases where important amounts of foreign investment are involved, and because you can use the accountability and grievance mechanisms from the multilateral financial institutions. They have, in some cases, that tools, and it's important to understand how those tools can be used as a part of a strategy, which include also local and national legal strategies. It's important as well to understand the other side. I mean, how the government operates, how they think, even the companies as well. And I would say also listen to them, what they have to say, not necessarily to agree with them, but to understand how that is important for the objectives you have your strategy to protect the environment, and even for finding solutions in cases where that opportunity is an option for the community and for your organization. For example, we participate in dialogue with government on mining issues, and we think that this is extremely important for our work here, because we understand many things that otherwise we couldn't understand without having that dialogue and that information. It's essential as well to identify. You need to find out who are in your side, even though it's not obvious. For example, there are rice producers who are trying to protect the water from mining activities, and they are usually not involved in advocacy or activism. They are usually conservative sectors, but for these purposes, they have been an important ally for the environmental movement, and it's essential to understand how can you agree with them in order to protect the environment and achieve your objectives in protecting ecosystems from mining. It's important as well to build consensus. That is not easy among these cases. There are several actors, political parties. You cannot imagine how challenging that can be. The way it works, and you need to adapt to that context. And a strategy to deal with that is definitely the idea of consensus to political context and understanding what is going on in a specific time in order to understand and to develop appropriately the timing for your interventions. For example, we have noted here that close to elections can be bad at some point because candidates can try to manipulate the environmental movement, but can be good as well, can feel the pressure because the elections are close and they need to present an appropriate approach to environmental protection. So this can be, you can take advantage of that eventually, depending on the context, depending on what you want to achieve. And have presidential elections. For a conflict, not only the environmental conflict itself, but also potential conflicts inside or within the organizations and the coalitions, because that happens as well and can be risky. I mean, a conflict that is not being managed appropriately can result in the ending of the coalition and in problems for the efforts you are doing to protect the environment. So it's important that. And finally, I would like to underline that it's important to advocate for good mechanisms and remedies. I mean, you can use the remedies, but you can work and fight as well to have good mechanisms or to avoid the degradation of mechanisms. For example, if you have the opportunity to influence legislation and that it's acceptable for your organization and you can do that and it's legal for your organization, I would suggest it's important to do that. Because finally, legislation and administrative regulation is the tool you work with, and the better is the tool, the better the results are going to be. Otherwise, in governments, I think they know that having not acceptable tools are not convenient for the strategies you are having in protecting the environment. For the same reason, technical independence for the agencies that provide inputs, technical inputs for the government and for decision processes are important as well. We have had technicians that want to do the right thing, but they are under pressure from their bosses or even from the high levels of the government, and for that we have had to fought for their independence because we understand it's essential for our strategies. We need to assess the risks. This is a general rule for us, not only assess the environmental risk or the social risk, but also to assess the human rights risk, as I said. It's important, especially in context of armed conflict or political violence or human rights violations like it happens here in Colombia. It's essential as well to share information with, not only with your partners, but also with the public. I mean, the level of information you're sharing is, I think, is crucial, and I think we need to find smart strategies to avoid competition between organizations and to achieve a very cooperative approach to the strategies we are having, because otherwise the strategy can be difficult. And also I think that this is essential and is something that each person can participate on, is supporting local initiatives. I mean, the big organizations are in the cities, but the people who knows what is going on are in the territories, and they need help, definitely. They need resources, they need technical support. They are fighting in some cases alone, and there are many ways to support them. And I think that is important to have that in mind, because the knowledge they have and the potential for environmental protection and activism is huge when they realize they can have support, they can create networks, and they can work in alliances. And it's important for them also because it allow them to empower, and the potential of this is very important. You cannot imagine the important impact that some small communities with limited resources can have in some initiatives here in Latin America. I have known cases where 4, 5, 10 persons with limited resources have generated problems with big mining projects at an important level. That is happening, for example, now with La Blosa and with the Santurban case. So this is in general the lessons we have learned from our work here. Thank you so much for the invitation.